We're back with part two from Here and Hell and Back again, inspired by the book Cold Storage by Wendell Rawls Jr. And George will be back online. We're going to let you listen to a clip of the interview from WFMT. It's archived in the Chicago Museum. It's called Cold Storage, and it's the story of Farview Hospital.
The second fight he's had with a prison guard, another he has had with another inmate, and the prison decides, we don't want to handle him, this is enough of that, and they send him to Farview. No hearing, no lawyer, no doctor saying he needs this sort of help, and he is now labeled.
Now, he's heard vaguely about Farview.
Oh, yes. It's in the prison grapevine.
And, by the way, did you know much about Farview before you undertook
Never
this?
heard of it.
You never heard of Farview?
Never heard
As
of
a journalist for the Bluff Inquirer.
As a journalist,
so it's
I
a
never heard of
well-kept secret.
Oh, yes.
Farview for the criminally insane.
The same man had called us, had called 9 other newspapers. Both of the other papers in Philadelphia, the 2 in Harrisburg, 2 in Pittsburgh, and none of them would listen to him.
Farview was a Pennsylvania secret.
Oh, yes.
Okay, we're back. You got to hear the Pennsylvania secret, and that is Cold Storage. And then we're going to branch off with From Here to Hell and Back Again by George P. Vanilla. And George is going to tell you about the book Cold Storage. We have it on pre-order, thank God. And we'll be able to document that there's documentation that Wendell Rawls Jr. had provided about what happened at Farview State Hospital. And we have documentation also that takes us back 50, 60 years. The law on HB 951 was about assault and crimes, but no one even reported it. So that explains why it never went to court, and why it would be a civil lawsuit, more or less. It would be a class action lawsuit with all the families that were impacted by what happened at Farview. I want you to highlight on the documentation that you will receive when you read that book, Cold Storage, again. Because didn't you read it before, George?
I haven't read it yet. I've studied, online about it, but I don't have a copy of the book yet.
Welcome back to the interview in an undisclosed location, George. We're in what we call the bunker. We're in a hideout. Well, the truth is that the psychiatric industry is notorious for making billions and billions of dollars in big pharma. This is like the big pharma case that no one in the psychiatric industry wants to see let out. It is the worst of the worst. It's the degradation of a human being. And you know how they all talk about stigma? You've been telling me about the stigma that this left to you and your family, because everyone referred to you as like, well, you're going to be like your dad. You're going to be crazy like him. And that really hurt you. And in the first interview, you were talking about how many fights you got into. This is very common. It's actually very common for people to use that as a manipulation, a tool to manipulate and hurt you and pin you back in a corner. So when you think of a class action lawsuit against the whole state and everyone that was involved in Farview, and I mean that's a lot of ground to cover. So we need some good attorneys that know the story about Cold Storage by Wendell Rawls Jr. You got to listen to a clip of it, the Pennsylvania's Dark Secret. And when you were talking about the ripple effect, we left off with a couple things. And if you remember where we left off, go ahead and start back there, because you got the floor.
Well, Jennifer, where we left off was, in the United States of America, it's all about money. If there's not money involved, it doesn't mean anything. Think about it. Reparations for black slaves, EEOC, reparations for Japanese Americans badly interned during World War II. We, in our capitalistic nation, money is what talks. So it's not about vengeance. It's not about me getting rich because I'm kind of an old guy right now. And, money's nice, but it symbolizes something. It symbolizes that if you're really repentant, then you talk money. Now, what was done to us, not only to my dad, was outrageous. They deprived him of making probably millions of dollars in his life that he could have made as a productive American citizen. But what was inflicted on me, the shame, the fist fights, the liability of me getting hurt or hurting somebody else, because I grew up relatively quick and strong, and I was a terrific football player and a hell of a fist fighter, and I carried a chip on my shoulder about that last name, and there was no way to describe. And then I got into science, and I was a force to be reckoned with, I'll tell you, and everybody knew it, and everybody was waiting for this kid, this George Vanilla, turn out just like his father and be grabbed by the system, incarcerated, never be seen again. Well, they got fooled. George Paul Pinella, by the grace of God, got an electrical engineering degree and became a productive citizen of the United States of America, and had a wife and kids, and didn't turn out like they did. But this George Pinella now, at 76 and a half years old, is determined that this story will be told in its entirety, and that just compensation for all of the countless numbers of people, a lot of Pinellas, my kids included, will be dished up. If they can dish up compensation for blacks, they can dish up compensation for Japanese Americans who were offended, then by golly, they can dish up compensation for the Pinella family, particularly me and my children and their children, because they have a right. I have a right to be proud of my father. They have a right to be proud of their grandfather. They have a right to be proud of their great-grandfather. They don't have to hide their head in shame when somebody brings up the name George Stephen Pinella, and someday they're running the public office, and some CNN reporter digs up some information, says, "Aren't you related to the man that was in the criminally insane?" They could hold their head up high and say, "That man is a hero. Boy, he survived."
Yeah.
Have
And
a
I
lot
wanted
to
to ask you, like, we talk about the stigma it left, because not all mental health industry programs are like this, by the way, so that we don't like throw anyone under the bus here. Well, there are programs that have done wonderful work with people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities. We're not talking about that. We're talking about how they fronted a hospital. They made it look like it was a hospital and used it as it was a forced labor camp is what it really was. And it was
a slave labor
it
camp.
was a slave labor camp. And what you see in with reparations to slavery would be no different than what happened up at Farview. What happened to George Floyd is no different than what happened up at Farview Hospital. These are the conditions that we've been in. And we just sat here and watched the riots in Minnesota. Imagine if there would have been riots in Pennsylvania over Farview Hospital, if they would have saw the conditions and the assault and the murders that occurred. And I know that what happened in Minnesota a couple yesterday led to the death of George Floyd. And we see this happening, and that's the same story of Farview, that they would do these suffocating a man to death with your kneecap. I mean, those are the kind of things that went on at Farview Hospital. So, criminally, they're liable. The criminal liability alone. We could go into what, first degree murder. We could go into also torture, torment. Um, uh, when I think of your dad, I think of your dad as a POW, because he had just got home from serving his country, so he hadn't been really home long enough before he was sent, quote, away to Farview. Like, did he even have a trial? Did he even go to court? I mean, because habeas corpus, we're all entitled to a fair trial. You know what I mean? So,
Now, Jennifer, can I speak now?
oh yeah, yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to go off. I
Uh,
I went on a
well,
tangent. I
I mean,
apologize.
well, we're off on a lot of tangents, and there's a lot of dimensions to the story. But I want to focus on what it was like, the ripple effect. For example, trying to date a girl. Everybody, in the neighborhood talk. What did you do? Oh, I'm so proud of my dad. He's from Ireland, and he did this. You know what? When it came around to me, I had to be quiet and hang my head. I had nothing. I knew nothing about my dad except that he was in a prison for the criminally insane. And I sure as heck wasn't going to tell all my friends or any girl that wanted to date me, oh, you know who you're thinking of dating and marrying? Oh my God. So you walk around in shame, constant shame. Any girl would have to be extremely brave to even consider being with you, dating you, associating with you, or God forbid, marrying you with that kind of a shame and family history. That's what they did. When these selfish clowns that used my father as a slave laborer inside those walls for decades, they did that to him. But what they did to me was every bit as rotten and ongoing for decades, and it affected my socialization, my dating, my procreation. It affected my children. You think my children can talk with pride like other kids do about their grandfather? They have to be quiet or act like they know nothing about him. That is not right. They have nothing to be ashamed of. He was a hero to suffer through what he did and even survive after the decades of torture and beatings and brain damage that he. And, I mean, the man was an absolute hero, and they can't say a word of pride when other people talk about their family history and they pull out all their books and show pictures. There's a vacant spot and a big silence when the name George Stephen Vanilla comes up. And of course, his son, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, so we don't talk about him either. So damage, rippling down through the generations for 100 years. I want you to think about that, Jennifer. I want you to think about hundreds of times where I was in situations where I had to hide my last name and not talk about it. And I could go on the countless ways that I developed to deal with that shame, undeserved shame.
And you didn't know as a little boy that whenever until you were 27 years old and the book's Cold Storage came out, it filled in all the stories that you didn't understand at 27, right? Is that how that worked out?
No, yeah, I saw the end product. It's kind of like looking at a car on a highway that's had a front-end collision. You see horrendous damage. You didn't witness the crash, but you know by looking at that car that it was in a big crash. But when I looked at my father in that prison, and I saw a destroyed human being who wouldn't even speak to me, who had a blank 500-mile stare, who was terrified to say a word with a guard standing over him, knowing he would be beaten senseless if he said anything, if he was even capable of saying anything. And I knew something horrible had been done to him, but I didn't know the specifics. I asked the officials for his records. They turned their back on me, wouldn't give them to me. But when Lou Rawls wrote the book, Cold Storage, he filled in the blanks about, I had a pretty good idea what was done to not only my father, but countless other men. So we, the families of my father, me, and other countless men need to get together and have a class action lawsuit of the first magnitude. I mean, I'm talking $100 million. The state of Pennsylvania needs to know the pain, that even a fraction of the pain that their stinking system inflicted on my father, me, my children, and the entire Fenella family and countless other families. And I call out those families to come forth and talk about. Don't hide their. Can you imagine these fools were billing people after they'd beaten their relatives to death, and Lou Rawls covers it, and tortured them? They actually sent them a bill for being in that hellhole. Of all the crust to do that, of all the crust these people they used in the slave labor to make bricks and so forth, and then they sent a bill along to the body. When they sent the body back to the family,
and they had to bury their son, and there was whistleblowers, and during that time the sheriff and the coroner were actually really doing something to help find out what happened, and they obliterated him politically from what we understand from the story. So George, I have a question about cold storage. It documents it, so that gives you a lot of credibility, and it gives your dad a lot of credibility. How does that feel when you feel vindicated by this book, Cold Storage, by Wendell Rawls Jr.?
There's a saying by Martin Luther King: God Almighty, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. Free at last. So that's the way I feel. I knew something went on, but until that book came out and I saw it and I found out what was in it, I couldn't really wrap my head around it or tell this story. But that book is so critical to the story getting out, and other people are finally coming because they did a tremendous job of covering this up. The Philadelphia Inquirer, the media, boy, they all played their role in this giant drama of cover up while the slave labor camp, the Auschwitz of the USA. It was the only hospital in the entire United States that was operating like a Nazi prison camp.
It was and it really
and
was.
Why? What was it about Pennsylvania, unlike any other state, that allowed such an Auschwitz, a slave labor camp, a torture chamber, to go on and on and on for decades and destroy countless lives directly and indirectly? What was it about the culture of that part of Pennsylvania or that corrupt state? You know, Jennifer, it got to the point I left Pennsylvania. I got my degree from Penn State, and you know I've lived in the West. I've lived a lot of places, but I've never really had an inclination to really go back there much because there's a bad taste in my mouth about what they did with my father, what they did with my last name, how it affected the attitude of my relatives toward me. I was considered something less than the other kids, the black sheep of the family, somebody born to fail, not like their kids. You know, they didn't carry the name Fenella, and they would do just fine. They would have their inheritances, and they would have their proud name. But that little boy, Fenella, he carries a bad name, and he's never going to. We don't have to treat him very nice. You see, the ripple effect went even into our own family. And even my mother, why should she have any care for me? I was a product of a bad seed, a man in a mental institute. And, you know, it just went on and on and on. You can analyze this to the umpteenth degree, and all you find is pain and misery. Well, the state of Pennsylvania has a sin, a black mark, a scourge, much like, you know, when we took Nazi Germany, we put them on trial at Nuremberg. And there needs to be a Nuremberg kind of trial in Pennsylvania. And we didn't care if it took, 50 years. The Israelis went into Argentina and South America and got Eichmann and put him on trial decades after he committed those atrocities.
I think that you're going to find out that President Trump really did something with the Korean War, and it wouldn't be impossible at all for President Trump to maybe even open the books on something like this, because he did with the Korean War. Oh, it's not impossible.
Jennifer, what can be done in court can be undone in court, is the old lawyer saying. This is not impossible to address this.
No, not at all.
If 100 years passes, this is a stain. You know, we still talk about the Mountain Meadows massacre, the stain on the Mormon church because of what happened at Mountain Meadows We still talk about wounded knee. They teach that every day in the school system. We still talk about slavery. We freed the slaves over 50 years ago or something, and they still talk about it and want reparations. So I ask you, and I ask the audience, why can't we talk about the Nazi Auschwitz that existed, that was called Farview State Prison for the criminally insane? And we can talk about all that, and we have a conscience, and we make reparations to the survivors and so forth. And what's different? Nothing is different. In fact, this story is even more compelling because we fought World War II. We were so pious and so up on our high horse about those rotten Germans and what they did when we were doing the same thing in the state of Pennsylvania. Except we didn't have the crematoria going. We sent the bodies back to the parents with a bill.
Look at how many children and families' lives have been impacted by this. And they were all children. They were all, George was a child and he didn't have any siblings. His mother went off, got married, and lived her life. And George was in an orphanage. And he, to this day, George, you are living with the effects of what happened to your dad. I mean, you really suffered as a child. We're out at the end of the blog spot.
You are.
And we're picking up with the blog and more with George. So
Yes.
Your childhood was totally impacted, and your adulthood, just the way you wanted to meet a girl, just everything that you would do, that you would typically go on a normal Saturday night date where you would meet, the parents. Your dad was incarcerated, and then you find out at 27 what really happened after you read the book Cold Storage. And now here we are years later, and you're still talking about it like it was like the story of Wounded Knee. It was one of the greatest untold story, the untold story and the untold effects that have occurred as a result of what happened at Farview Hospital. So when you go, if we were to sit down and talk to an attorney in a class action lawsuit, they would sit down and they would have to go through everything, the medical reports, doctor's reports. They might not be able to do all that. I mean, by today's standards, they have to go based on that book, Cold Storage, more or less, right? Wouldn't that be the case?
No, because this has affected not just my father, but has affected many other people that went through that place.
Okay.
So there is a record. There are plenty of records.
Okay.
They have hidden those records, but they are there. And when you take a court order, when I asked for the records, I was only George and all of the son. They wouldn't give them to me. If I had an attorney with me, I guarantee I would have gotten those records. And those
okay.
records exist.
Okay,
And,
I see.
You know what I'm saying? It
Yeah.
can be done. Remember, Jenny, that what can be done in court can be undone in court. This story needs to be uncovered. The fact that that Wendell Rawls could get all the information he got, he documented in his book how he got it, means that it can be gotten. And he did the homework.
Well,
He laid
I
the
think
basis for a massive lawsuit.
I think the timing is unbelievable. I think the timing of this,
the state of Pennsylvania.
yeah, people will have.
This cannot be unresolved. This cannot go unaddressed. This is an atrocity on the equivalent of the Nazi prison camps at Auschwitz and Treblinka, and nothing less. The only thing missing was the crematoria. Other than that, you could have had Nazi prison guards in there.
We only have a couple more minutes, but what I want you to state the timing of the George Floyd case in Minnesota. More or less, people would have rioted over what happened to your dad, and they would have done the same thing that they did in Minnesota. So the timing of this and exposing the crimes that are going on in the criminal justice system, like those police officers could be held for murder. I mean, that's what's going on with the prison guards. These prison guards that were involved in there have been stories told to me by people from New York and other places in the United States that they do not go to Pennsylvania. And this is why. It is because of Farview. Farview has impacted so many people's lives that people do not even live in Pennsylvania because of it. And they
Yeah,
don't know the whole story, but they know
you
what's going on.
Jennifer, you hit an important point. One way people can fight back, they can boycott the state of Pennsylvania and make it clear to them why they're boycotting it is what happened at Farview many years ago. And if millions of people refuse to spend money in Pennsylvania and refuse to support that state in any way, believe me, money talks. Remember what I said in the beginning? Money in a capitalist society, what's what talks. And once they are losing millions and billions of dollars, they will open the books. They will come clean. They will put people on trial. They will pay compensation. They will have to fix this, or they will find a massive boycott of the entire state of Pennsylvania by irate people who say we are not going to tolerate an Auschwitz prison camp existing in our country while we proclaim to be overseas with millions of fighting soldiers freeing Germany from the Nazis, blah, 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 while we conduct a Auschwitz right in the state of Pennsylvania. This is outrageous.
I think the
It's
United
beyond
States
outrageous.
Army needs to declare your dad a POW, prisoner of war. I think if
And
the
they need to.
United States Army would declare that your dad was a prisoner of war because he was still, I want to know, there's a lot to know about your dad's active duty status and what happened that led to him not being in the army because he was just leaving. He just came home, and there's a lot of stories yet that have to be uncovered, and I'm pretty sure records have a way of, well, let's just say having some records helps bring more pieces to the story. George, I wanted to let you have the last of it. When
All
you
right.
go from
Let
here,
me tell you this. There's records are fine, but logic counts too, and common sense.
oh yeah,
And
yeah,
remember, I told you this didn't happen to my father alone. So it happened to a lot of other men and a lot of other families. They will come forth, and
yeah.
they will have courage to do what I'm doing and say, wait a minute, we were always in shame because our brother, our husband, our son was in there. No, I'm not going to be quiet anymore. And there's going to be 100, maybe 1,000 George Paul Pinellas stepping forward saying, I want to be in on the lawsuit, on the boycott, on the exposure. And if President Trump knew this story, he would be outraged. I'm sure he's a good man, and he would say, you know what, we're going to conduct a congressional investigation, and we will use the power of the Congress to unearth every single record and find out. And then we will use common sense and logic because, there you can extrapolate pretty well and tell a story without having every single document. It's called circumstantial evidence. We have convicted people and sent them to prison on circumstantial evidence. You know the difference between that and regular evidence, right? Well, even if there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, it's so compelling that it screams out that what was done there by these selfish, greedy, as you say, they're not adjectives strong enough to describe those people, self-serving individuals, not only in the prison, but in the surrounding communities that are all benefiting nicely from the cheap bricks and the free labor and all the rest of the inmates paid nothing for their labor at Farview Hospital for decades.
George, thank you for telling us.
This story has to come out.
Yeah, and it is, and we're gonna do as many more interviews until we get this right, because there might be some things we need to iron out. We do know it needs to be a class action lawsuit, and after President Trump exposing some of the things about the Korean War, and discovering a Korean War veteran's body after almost 50 years. I mean, there are things still coming out after all this time. So I do not think it's too late, George. It is not too late to see something happen. Many people leave Pennsylvania because of the effects of the impact of the mental health industry in Pennsylvania, and it's because of Farview that it's an American prison camp. And remember this when you listen to our story, we're going to do a couple more interviews, George. We're going to get it right, you know. And I just want to end off with this. I did say, George, you're going to have the final word. You have about 30 seconds.
The final word, Jennifer, is courage, courage, courage. People have to have the courage to come forth, tell their story. Other people have the courage to put the facts together no matter where it goes. Other people have to have the courage to go to court. Other people have to have the courage, the judges, and the people of all, most of all, Pennsylvania has to be embarrassed and have the courage to say, we are not going to tolerate our state having this reputation being stained. I was stained by what they did to me.
George, I thank you so much for taking the time to share more about this, and there's still so much more
behind those walls.
And when you get the book Cold Storage and you can really get into it, I think the interview is going to change a lot from what we hear and what we read. And I look forward to that next interview when the chance is available. So thank you again.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for a fantastic opportunity to bring forth an American tragedy.
Yeah. Thank you for joining the program. And George is a guest co host, and he is sharing his story. And we will continue to fight back for those who are been and lost their lives, are losing their lives to a prison system, just like what happened with George Floyd up there in Minnesota. It's the same thing. It is going on right in front of us, and it's they cannot hide the facts. The fact is that when prisoners are left imprisoned, they are trapped like animals. And we are so thankful for you, George, because I think this story is. There are other stories that in Pennsylvania, as you know, and George and I have talked extensively about other things that are going on in the mental health system that need to be cleaned up now. So thank you.
Amen, Jennifer.
Hey George, did you want to offer any insight for the next program and broadcast?
Oh, I've got all kinds of insight, Jennifer. But let's keep our audience in suspense because I have many, many more stories to tell about all of the ramifications. We have only begun. This is only the beginning of a long journey. We have only begun to uncover, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story.
You said it perfect. Thank you again. Thank you all for joining our broadcast and our program. Thank you. And thank you, George. I'll talk to you later.
You got it.
Okay, great.